Thank you, Srinivas. This is not a very interesting or a very, what to call, I can't think of a better word. It's not a very interesting topic. Not many people are interested in nutrition. And I am very fond of this slide. I show it in many places. Basically what this slide shows is that the knowledge of the residents, of the students, of the medical stream is very limited as far as nutrition is concerned. And the fault lies in the fact that neither the undergraduate medical curriculum nor the postgraduate medical curriculum, it includes details about nutrition and nutritional support. Now, we could spend an entire day discussing nutritional management in GI surgery, and therefore 10 minutes is too short a time to actually deal with such a topic. And I have therefore taken the liberty of deciding what to tell you and what not to tell you. So it is, what I'm going to tell you is what I feel is important. You may not feel important, but this is what I feel is important to know about nutrition as it stands today. So Hiram Studley in the year 1936 wrote an article in which he showed the importance of preoperative weight loss in peptic ulceration. And there was a distinct link between the preoperative weight loss and the postoperative mortality. As you can see it was a 3.5% versus a 33% mortality in those who had a less or more than 20% weight loss. The concept of nutrition-based or the definition of malnutrition as it stands today is changing, or has rather changed, and it is traditional markers like serum albumin, etc., are no longer considered good markers of the nutritional status. And the concept of malnutrition now includes two things. One is the nutrition risk, which is identified, and that is identified either as a compromised intake of nutrients or a loss of body mass. And the second component of nutrition is whether there is inflammation present or no. So if there is a nutritional deficit but there is no inflammation, then you have what is called starvation related nutrition. Do we have a pointer? Pointer, please. So we have starvation related nutrition here, pure starvation or anorexia nervosa, these are the examples here. If you have mild to moderate degree of inflammation, you have chronic disease related malnutrition like organ failure, cancer, arthritis, and sarcopenic obesity. We'll talk about this in the next slide. And when the inflammatory response is marked, you have acute disease or injury related malnutrition like in major infection, burns, trauma, and so on. So this concept of nutrition has changed, and it includes markers of nutrition. And nutrition now has been divided into 6 core areas, and all the areas needs to be assessed before you can say whether this patient actually has malnutrition. A word about sarcopenic obesity, because we are now dealing with more and more overweight patients. Morbid obesity is becoming a major health issue even in a poor country like India. And we have a lot of patients who have chronic diseases and are overweight. And the problem with these patients is that they may have a loss of fat-free mass, that is sarcopenia, but they may still be overweight, and it is very difficult to judge with conventional indicators. So with conventional indicators like body mass index, it is very difficult, or weight loss, very difficult to assess this kind of fat-free mass loss, and we need advanced techniques of body composition evaluation to actually assess this. Now, malnutrition before GI surgery is caused by decreased food intake, the pre-existing chronic disease, tumor cachexia, the impaired absorption because the intestine has been resected earlier or the intestine is obstructed, and in addition the low socioeconomic status of our patients is an additional risk factor. The reported in-hospital prevalence of malnourished patients on admission ranges up to 50%. And therefore, nutritional screening and assessment and therapy are important parts of the treatment of or surgical care of such patients. Now, why do we want to assess these patients, or why do we want to recognize malnutrition in these patients? Is because malnourished patients have a significantly higher morbidity and mortality, a longer length of stay, and increased hospital costs. We also now know from the very large volume of scientific evidence present that perioperative nutrition has been convincingly shown to improve clinical outcome in patients undergoing major GI surgery and to reduce costs. About this, there should not be any doubt, and I am not going to highlight this fact again. However, the questions which remain to be answered are what patient to select, what is the timing of this nutrition, what is the route of administration, and the type of nutritional support which is required, and we will try and look at these things. So, there are two terms which are being used these days. One is nutritional screening and one is nutritional assessment. So, nutritional screen is just you do a basic screen of the patient. There are various tools to do that. And then if you find that this patient is at nutritional risk, then you do a detailed evaluation of the 6 core components of the nutritional assessment. So one of the most recognized tools for nutritional screening in surgical patients is the nutritional risk score or screening score that is officially recommended by the ESPEN. And the prevalence of patients at risk evaluated by NRS varies in literature from about 14% to 32%. So about nearly 1/3 of the patients are at nutritional risk. So how are these patients defined to be at nutrition risk? If this score is more than 3 or equal to 3. However, if you don't have this score, then we can look at weight loss of 10 to 15% within 6 months, BMI of less than 18.5, and other screening tools, subjective global assessment, grade C, albumin less than 3. Now, despite my saying that serum albumin is no longer considered an important or a part of the nutritional assessment, it still remains one of the most important indicators for postoperative complications. And for these patients, major surgery should be postponed until the nutritional status has been corrected. Then another way of looking at this is we can classify patients into different groups. One is the high-risk group for where nutritional support is needed. And these are malnourished patients with carcinoma of the GIT, liver, pancreas, or gallbladder. We have a low-risk group where nutritional support is not needed. There are patients who are young and well-nourished. And there is an intermediate risk group where nutritional support can be considered. They may be well-nourished, but more than the age is higher, or malnourished at any age, colorectal malignancies, and another concept, IONIP, in the inadequate oral nutrient intake period after surgery. The IONIP is more than 7 or 10 days, and you know they are not going to start eating in the next 7 or 10 days, then nutritional support can be considered. Now, nutritional support can be administered, as you all know, in 3 different ways. You could do it with nutritional supplements, through a feeding tube, or parenterally. Now, enteral nutrition is by far the most important way of feeding patients, and according to the ESPEN guidelines, enteral tube should always be preferred unless there is intestinal obstruction, shock, intestinal ischemia, severe malabsorption. An example is multiple fistula with high output. Now, we're going to talk a little about what are the newer things which are happening to the nutritional support. And it has been shown that even in well-nourished patients, perioperative nutritional support positively influences postoperative outcome. Enhanced recovery after surgery programs have developed for such patients with a particular focus to minimizing preoperative fasting period, maximizing carbohydrate load, and initiating early nutrition support. And I'm going to concentrate on this, initiating early nutrition support. Postoperatively, normal oral food intake or nutrition through feeding should start within the first 24 hours. A recent meta-analysis has, considering this early enteral nutrition versus traditional management, went in favor of early enteral feeding, showing reduced morbidity and mortality rates. What is the logic for this early nutrition? The acute logic is the acute phase response in these patients undergoing surgery is immediate. Levels of serum enterotoxin peak within the first 12 hours. Microbial translocation occurs soon after. And the mucosal metabolism correlates to the outcome. And therefore, if you feed these patients enterally, all these things will be reduced. We are always afraid to feed the patient. The traditional teaching has been, wait till the patient passes bladders before you can feed. But we must recognize the fact that small intestinal motility recovers in 6 to 8 hours, even after very extensive surgery and surgical trauma. And absorptive capacity exists even in the absence of normal peristalsis. So post-operative enteral feeding, undergoing GI's resection is safe and well tolerated even when started within 12 hours of surgery. So we must choose an appropriate delivery method, however we want to feed, and there is no specific advantage of using a jejunostomy tube if you can do the same thing with a nasogastric or a nasojejunal tube. Another important aspect of nutrition, which is again being talked about in GI surgery, is the immunonutrition. And this nutritional support is enriched with specific immune modulating substrates: glutamine, arginine, omega-3 fatty acids, and RNA. And commercial formulas are available which give you different combinations of these products, and the strength of each component may vary with the different formulations. So more than 2,000 patients included a meta-analysis. Perioperative immunonutrition significantly reduced the length of hospital stay, post-operative infectious complications, and post-operative non-infectious complications. So we have at least 8 reviews and meta-analysis, all on immune nutrition in GI surgery, which are published, available for anyone of you to go and read. And all of them conclude that perioperative immune nutrition improves outcome from surgery. What is still not clear is whether it is preoperative, perioperative, or postoperative, the timing of the nutrition, and which is the optimal regimen for giving, what is the most effective dosage, and out of all these components, which component is the most important component. And these are things which need further study. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Gurpreet Singh sir, for your very nice and comprehensive talk on nutrition. And to add to that, we even in all anastomosis, even our residents are closing the ostomy, they start oral in the evening if you are doing in the morning. So it's not that you need to have a peristalsis. That is a very big myth in our society. So I think it doesn't even increases the leak rate, and if your technique is good, if your tissue is healthy, so this early to starting early is not going to harm the anastomosis. So with these words, I am opening this particular talk, not the first one, for the questions and comments. Yes, please introduce yourself.
Dr. Ashok Sharma, practicing surgeon, Chandigarh. As you said, the nutrition to be started, about something you mentioned about the type of foods, like components. You would recommend artificial powders available in the market or natural food?
It depends upon what is available to you. We are very lucky at PGI that we have a very good dietetics department. And they give us different formulations according to what we require. In fact, it may be worthwhile for you to have a look. They publish a book which gives all the diets and all the constitutions of the diets. We are very fond of a diet which is available in this dietetics department, which is called the jejunostomy feed. And we have actually looked at this feed and done work on this and seen that it works. It produces positive nitrogen balance. It works in non-cancer patients, cancer patients, early trauma patients. This is all published literature from this. this institute.
See, as we are in the outside.
So if you can actually look at the formulation and make it yourself, because this is a blenderized diet. It's very easy to do. But if you are not having that kind of even basic infrastructure, then commercially available diets are available for you.
Commercially available diets, we have tried many times, and they lead to loose motions to the patient post-operative.
Any time when you are providing all enteral feeds are hyperosmolar. Whenever you are feeding the patient directly into the intestine with hyperosmolar, you will get diarrhea. So the trick is to actually dilute these diets, build up the volume, and then build up the concentration. So it doesn't mean that from day one you will be able to provide all the required calories and proteins from day one. You may take up to 4 days to build up this, or 5 days to build up this.
Anything you can elaborate on the details? You have the type of food in your PGR?
Sir, offhand I will not be able to tell you the exact constitutions, but I think what I will do is I will buy that book and give it to you.
Thank you very much.
Dr. President, sir, I have one question.
Yes, sir.
When we were training here, bile reading used to be a big thing actually. I mean, I don't believe in that, but I thought your
There
opinion
has
on
been
it.
a big talk on your WhatsApp group on that. Yes. I don't know. See, bile refeeding was being done at a time, long time back when I joined this institute, bile refeeding was a big thing. I don't think I'm the right person actually to be talking on this, because there are so many guys who are doing GI surgery here and know more about this than me. But I think we've changed over in the fact that we realize that it is not serving the purpose which it was thought to serve. And nowadays, if we are looking at doing bile diversion, we are doing it internally rather than feeding, because bile is not something very palatable. So different kinds of things have been done. You know, when I joined this place, it used to be said you use lemon and honey, add that to the bile. And then we had a German visitor who said you add beer to the bile, you know, all kinds of things, but it's not very palatable. So the important thing is it doesn't serve the purpose for which it was used, so I think it's been given up. But I stand to correction from all other people.
I think it's how much duration you are going to have a bile diversion. If we are still doing this PT-BD in many cancer gallbladder patients because they have a confidence blocked, and most of our endoscopy, they are not very comfortable with putting internal stenting. So if you are having a obstructive jaundice patient for 1 month history and he is coming and you are putting a PT-BD for another 1 month, then all the complications of this bile diversion is going to occur. So what to do? If you are not able to internalize, I think bile refeed, you have to, I think, convince it is not palatable, it's not pleasant, but it can be done. And it's a requirement like a medicine, so we can convince them. I have picked up this B-complex syrup mixture, got from one of my friend, and I put in my OPD and I give it to all the patients, and they have in biliary fistula, and they put a mix up with 2 or 3 drops, and most of them they are saying that it's much better than what it is. So it's not something which is required. I think it's compulsion. Once it is required, one has to do it. Otherwise, there is no other way to supplement. Yes, Rajnish, I think want to say.
Excellent talk, sir. Actually, it probably determines more of our results in surgical practice than we ever give credit to. One of the areas of interest is apogeic cancers. I work closely with a team of oncologists and radiation oncologists. The biggest problems we face in India, especially, and I'm assuming that's the case in most centers in this country, is malnutrition. The patients are simply not fit for example, esophageal cancer, are not fit for the kind of regime which we try to impose on them in terms of chemotherapy and surgery. The problem I face, and I haven't seen the answer in your talk, but you can enlighten us on that. We know nutrition is important, and we say that ad nauseum in our tumor board. Our patients know that these doctors mean business. The problem is, we can't give them targets, which means I can't tell them how much to take. I can't tell them when will I operate you. I can't tell them will your BMI go from 18 to 20 and you will get surgery then, or when your albumin rises from 3 to 3.2 and you get surgery then. These are areas which are extremely grey. I'm not sure the answers are available or not. Perhaps you can tell us what are the specific advices you can say, not to the patient alone. These are advices which the clinical team also needs. as to what we are going to aim for?
I don't know how far I am the right person to be answering these questions. I think you are equally well experienced in surgical practice as I am. But I'll try and answer your questions. The first thing is we need to identify those patients in whom we cannot operate without providing nutritional support, and I've shown you the risk groups. So that is the first thing which we need to do. We do need a detailed nutritional assessment. We decide that this patient, all therapy needs to be postponed until we can provide nutritional support. Now, if we look at serum albumin as a marker and we try and feed these patients, then you find that serum albumin begins to rise at the end of 2 weeks and continues to rise, and then by about 3 weeks time this albumin reaches about close to 3. As I said, serum albumin is not a good marker for assessing nutrition. It is now very well recognized, and nobody says that serum albumin is a nutrition assessment tool. All it says is that serum albumin correlates very well with the outcome. So if you want to use that as a marker, it is all right. Now, in general, it is said that a preoperative feeding period of 7 to 10 days is the minimum which is required before you will do any planned procedure. So 7 to 10 days of feeding, and then in the perioperative period you can continue with the feeding. So the important thing, that is why I highlighted the fact that early enteral nutrition is very important. I was very fond of doing jejunostomies in all my major GI surgery procedures, whether it was an esophageectomy or a Whipple. I would do a jejunostomy and the next day the patient would be on feed. It takes would take us about 3 to 4 days to match the needs of the requirements of the patient. But you may not be giving the entire caloric requirement, protein requirement, but you are giving something to the patient, and that reduces the catabolic or the metabolic response of the patient. So that is helpful. So pre-operative feeding of 10 days at least, and then perioperative nutrition is what I would suggest. However, this would need to be individualized to the patient. Very often you asked about weight changes and BMI changes, so height doesn't change, so it's only going to be weight. What you may find is that the weight of the patient may decrease after you start feeding, and that is because of the excess water which is there in the patient. Patient loses that because the serum proteins begin to rise and the water all goes away. So the patient may actually have a weight loss. You may notice a weight loss after you start feeding the patient and your feeding becomes effective. So you have to have a clinical judgment, so you may see the edema disappear, and that you may take as a good indicator, because now you know that the serum proteins are rising, rather than saying now that the weight has gone down and it has become worse.
That's the part of the problem. Patients say that is what you told me.
Yeah.
Not when you operate.
So that's what I said. I said as a benchmark, as a standard benchmark, 7 to 10 days of pre-operative feeding before you intervene. Individualize if you feel that the patient is still not recovering. If you go on feeding the patient and the patient is having sepsis, no amount of feeding is going to help the patient. So that is an indirect way of saying that this patient has sepsis. The albumin, the patient's nutritional parameters will just not increase. So you have to individualize according to the patient. So if you have a very, that's the importance where the inflammation comes in. So if you have somebody has marked inflammation, that's, you have the acute injuries and patients who come with injury and have marked inflammation as part of their malnutrition component, then your aim is not to improve the nutritional status of the patient, but the aim is to sustain them with enough to get them through this period of inflammation. Let the inflammation subside and then your nutrition. It has to be a balance. It has to be a balance. That concept has not changed. However, the concept of hypocaloric feeding has come in, that you can underfeed the patient and that will also reduce the catabolic response. As I said, we can discuss this nutrition for one full day in a CME and we will still not be at the end of the... I hope I have answered some of your queries.
Now I would like to begin the case presentation. I request the moderators to kindly come on stage. Dr. R.A. Shastri, Dr. Sadiq S. Sikora, Dr. Rupesh Mehta, and Dr. Avinash Supe.
My teacher and mentor for I'll be briefly presenting a case of Euler stricture, and I will require the opinion of the experts in the house about the management of this particular patient. 19-year-old male patient admitted with history of recurrent right upper quadrant abdominal pain for last 2 years. Also history of intermittent jaundice associated with pruritus and pale stools, 2 years duration. No history of cholangitis. No history of weight loss or loss of appetite. No history of previous abdominal surgery or trauma. Examination wise, icterus is present. No pallor or no neck nodes. Abdomen and rectal examination normal, unremarkable. Laboratory test, CBC is normal. LFT shows the obstructive pattern. CA99 is normal. Ultrasound examination showed hilar stricture with intrahepatic radical dilatation, and we evaluated him further with MRCP. This is a MRCP picture, and it is reported as biliary hilar obstruction, most likely by mass causing dilatation of right and left lobe intrahepatic ducts. So I would like the opinion of experts how to proceed in this particular case. Lights. Lights, please.
So it's a young boy, young man, 19-year-old, with a long history.
2 years.
So it's a long history, young man with intermittent, you said, jaundice. So are there any periods when jaundice completely subsides?
Yes, sir. Yes. There was in between.
So in between the jaundice is not
Yes.
there. And there is no history of cholangitis.
No history of cholangitis.
Any, no peripheral nodes, chest
Nothing.
x-ray,
Nothing. Everything was normal.
chest x-ray is normal.
Normal. Normal.
So,
Everything comes down to normal, or was it sometimes from 5.5 to 3?
So we don't have the records, but history-wise they used to tell that the jaundice used to subside completely. It was intermittent.
and on M.
Any other images you want?
Pancreatic duct.
Normal. It is
The other thing which I wanted to know is on MR imaging, are there any lymph nodes, intra-abdominal lymph nodes,
no, sir,
retroperitoneal lymph
nothing,
nodes?
sir. Apart from this picture, nothing.
And mass lesion, the characteristics you have said that it is just a mass lesion.
Yes, sir.
Any,
Yes, it most likely a mass
I would like to see the axial images if they are
There are
there.
few images.
And-
Can we have images?
Nothing than reconstruction and rotation.
Only few images are available. MRI, MRCP, both. There are some axial cuts also. Non-contact.
non-contact, of course, but let's just see what it shows.
Next.
brother, can you see?
No varices, spleen appears with no varices.
I would like to assess this hilar mass, and I think I would be more comfortable having a CT scan, in contrast CT, to see the enhancement pattern and other things, so that we get a better idea about that. And of course, to see, say there are low nodes, so I just want to see that. As somebody mentioned, that the spleen also looks enlarged, so we would like to see the spleen is also enlarged. The main idea being to define that area, main mass lesion, and with this kind of history, I would like to see whether it is accessible for any histological diagnosis.
It's an unusual problem. A 19-year-old prolonged jaundice, mild, no cholangitis, no constitutional symptoms. It would fit in what I was describing as an indeterminate stricture. There is a mass. Even indeterminate strictures can have a mass. So this mass lesion obviously needs to be further investigated, either by a CT or an endo-ultrasound and cytology and biopsy. If we have facilities for a corridoroscopy, yes, either or a crash, yeah. Before you resort to spyglass, you can. The spyglass is not freely available everywhere, so you do. There is probably an indication for ERCP and brushings also.
Yeah,
ERCP or PTCD, we would like to do a CT with the rotational imaging. That is what is currently talked about. That gives you much better idea rather than doing any invasive procedure like ERCP or PTCD.
Tuberculosis, extrinsic compressions with nodal masses like lymphoma and that kind would come in the differential diagnosis here. And with those aims, we would like to investigate.
You're thinking more of a benign
Yes,
cause
because
versus
it's 2 years.
2 years.
2 years, with no progress, intermittent.
ERCP
We had one patient with a pseudo tumor there, yes, of this kind.
Any comment from the audience, please?
Mic, please.
It was done somewhere outside. All those things were negative. Why did you do that? 2 years he has been evaluated for many.
One comment from here. You microphone here. It's open for everyone. Please comment, make suggestion, ask questions. Everyone is welcome.
I think, as the expert panel said, this is not actually enough to proceed to intervention. We need to have property imaging, a CT photograph, evaluate the mass, relate to the structure, and
The vascular structures are free.
this MRCP is not enough to decide about, especially with the mass leak.
Yeah, mass lesion, the vascular.
On a plain MR, we need a contrast study evaluation.
I think he had one Doppler report also. That is the only report for the vascularity.
We need a CT or MR contrast.
CT was not done. CT was not done in this particular.
Mic, please.
Mic.
If it says there's a mass lesion, you take a picture shot and evaluate further. Rather than say and confirm that this is a mass lesion, that is saying what a mass lesion is. You need a contrast image, which means either a contrast MR or a contrast CT. That would be mandatory before you see it.
Because see, if you do PTC or PTBD or ERCP, it would show a similar pattern. It would still not give you an idea whether it is extrinsic, intrinsic, mass, vasculature, its extent. All that would not get a good idea, unless you get tissue, and again tissue biopsy you are not going to get. So both the things you are not right. So either do a CT with rotational imaging or do something like spyglass with a biopsy or something.
ERCP brushings were done, but it was inconclusive. And assuming that it is a resectable mass, assuming that this is a resectable mass, you don't have a CT, assuming that it is a resectable mass, how to proceed? It is a resectable mass. The ducts are, the second order
ducts are very close. On the left side, it is almost a separation, the second order level also. And
most of the people are comfortable with the 3D CT image. So here, RCP, with MRI, UNMR photography, which is this another software. Many radiologists also, in many panels we have discussed, they are not very happy. So, I think everybody agrees that at least you need to have a CT.
As you said, for surgery, I would not be very keen to take this patient to operating theatre before making enough efforts to establish the diagnosis by trying to get tissue either CT guided or by endoscopic means or EUSM. I would exercise all my efforts to try to get that rather than take the patient to the operating table, because I don't think it's run-of-the-mill cholangiocarcinoma. If it's an unusual kind of tumor, we should be able to make an assessment by some better imaging or other efforts. Then only I would, if it was a short history, very definitive mass, I may for a moment think with this, but with 2 years history, I would want more before I take the patient to the operating table.
And there might be quite a few instances like so where actually surgery might not require. We inflammatory pseudo tumor, treatment is steroids, it's TB, then treatment is AGT. So I don't think surgery, even if it's a resectable lesion, surgery is not the next step.
Let's for a moment assume it is cholangiocarcinoma. I would still reserve ERCP till after I've got all my cross-section imaging done. This is a common mistake which happens in our practice. I think Sari knows about it. ERCP is done invariably spends a image. Then any imaging, cross-section imaging becomes very difficult. So if you are thinking of getting a cross-section imaging in the form of a CT angiography or MRI angiography, it has to be done before you try to do even a tissue diagnosis in the ERCP. Because once ERCP is done, it will be sent to it.
even I had asked for medical gastroenterologist not to do ERCP because
That's always the case. So you have to
it was under medical gastroenterology department initially, and after the ERCP there was no backup of, they did not take a backup of PDBD, and he went into cholangitis, shock, inotropes, and then he recovered.
They put one stent or two stents.
They were able to put only one stent. They were not. I told them if
Another problem in this case.
they were able to put only one stent.
System
Left side.
and trying to put in one system again is going to cause problems. So I think ERCP should be added. Maybe you have to hold on.
So we did not get the house is of the opinion that CT should have been done. We did not get the CT, but we subjected him to surgical resection. Because of the young age, long duration, as everyone is pointing, we did a local resection, and there were 3 ducts on the left side and 2 ducts on the right side, and we did ductoplasty and did a bilateral hepatocygnostomy, 2 hepatocygnostomies, and post-op it has come as, the biopsy has come as gastric heterotopia in the gallbladder with a hilar stricture. Sir, then after that I went through the literature. There are only few cases are reported in the literature, about 15 cases of gastric heterotopia in the gallbladder. It is said that because of the gastric heterotopia, the surface secretes acid. So there will be a dense inflammatory reaction and it leads to the stricture formation. It was fibrosis, only fibrosis. Frozen section I took, sir. It was there was no evidence of malignancy. But even once I resected, then I thought I cannot go beyond because there are already 2 ducts on the right side, anterior posterior, which I had to do ductoplasty, and then on the left side there were 3 ducts. So I thought I may not get any further adequate margin. Which way to go, which side to resect? No, it is only a local resection. I assumed it to be a benign based on the long duration of history, young age, CA99 being normal, I took a chance. It was a tight inflammatory, it was like tight, it is difficult to differentiate, it was all fibrosed, thick fibrotic tissue.
How is he now?
He had a post-operative bile leak, we didn't know from which side, and later on, it was there for 3-4 days, and then later on he presented with on and off cholangitis. Every 2-3 months he used to get fever and all. Initially managed with antibiotics, then we did a repeat MRCP that shows a prominence of left duct, this segment 2 and 3 duct is prominent, 4 is okay, 2 and 3 is prominent, and the right system is normal. It is almost 4 years now. Now he is not getting any cholangitis, or he is fine now. Initial 2 years, I was just thinking, I showed the CD once to Dr. Sadiq also in Manipal. I don't know whether he remembers or not. I showed that CD. No, not after the first surgery. Once he started getting cholangitis.
I think it's obviously it's unusual.
Unusual, yes.
And I would still want to think and see that how we would proceed. I mean, let's say that we do all this evaluation and then we don't make any headway. And then what would be our approach in such a situation to when we are operating? That means do we do local resection, or we go ahead and do a hepatectomy so that you have single duct and a better anastomosis in a young person, because you are looking at long-term and a non-malignant lesion. I mean, those are things I think I would still think about, and of course we'll take the decision operatively based on how much of the extrahepatic ductal system is involved and how much I get proximal to the lesion, to decide whether local excision or better hepatectomy.
We understand all the sophisticated investigations will not be available. Under such circumstances, obviously the clinical profile suggests a more benign problem. And the minimum investigation, probably extra investigation, I would have asked would have been.
Sometimes he has been getting investigated for the last 2 years.
No, CD is such a common investigation. A cross-sectional imaging is, I think, mandatory before you do it. Surgery, yes. After the CT also, if you are not able to get to a diagnosis, based on the entire, you review the entire situation, clinical profile, the progress of the history of the disease itself, and considering the young age and the fitness of the patient and your own capabilities. Probably there is something wrong in going ahead with a local institution with a firm section after doing it. Because the unusual localized sclerosis cholangitis and this kind of benign problems of unusual nature you may encounter. I would have done a liver resection for an 18-year-old man with this condition. If forced for surgery, definitely I would have done the same. But the same question, I agree that that advice is quite valid. But what if he had come across a non-reconstructible ducts on either side? He had gone too far into the liver. You would have to do a liver resection. Then we would have been in trouble.
And even now, I mean, we don't know how good or bad your
He had leak.
there is a probability of success at a later date. But anyway, I think that's the point of debate, that depending on what you find, you would have to take a decision. As Reddy said, if you find you're going too much in, you may have to choose that's a better option than having problems of filing and not needing
So you can really have a review after some time and see whether some portion is atrophied and other hypertrophied, and he is now adjusted, and later on he should not have a lot of problem. But as Rajnish said, if you have gone unprepared and you have found that ducts are too inside, then on the table you would have really caused a lot of problems. I mean, it's okay, you've taken one decision and you have come out of that, so let's hope.
So, let me just say, like like everyone has said, the take-home messages in this are: A, get in such a situation, get as much as is available to you evaluation before you operate. ERC is to be put off till you make a decision that you need to go in, and be prepared based on what you find to take a definitive decision.
So to conclude, Hylar strictures are a heterogeneous group of benign and malignant conditions. Definitive diagnosis, in spite of all these imaging, various investigations, can be achieved in only 40 to 60% of patients. In absence of clear benign etiology, it is usually treated as malignant stricture, but benign conditions are still possible and clinical judgment is important. Thank you.
Raman Kiran, my full name is Radev Ramandeep Singh. I've just joined about a year and a half ago DMC. We have continued at DMC's liver transplant unit as an HPP and liver transplant surgeon. I hope you can recognize yourself in the picture. Dr. Srinivas Reddy. And what I really want to thank is I want to thank Professor Yadav for introducing me to this group. I've been away for a long time, and this is my actually first visit to PGI. Starting with the case, sorry, there's so an easy afternoon when I was almost preparing that maybe it's time to wind up and go home. Just got a call, and I just give you a brief history about the patient before that. It's a 33-year-old male. He was a known case of extrahepatic portal vein obstruction with portal bilirubin. He had previous gastric variceal bendings in the past. Patient was admitted in gastroenterology with cholangitis, and the diagnosis was a blocked stent. Patient at admission had HB of 10.4, bilirubin of 11, INR 1.6, creatinine was 1.3. He was spiking temperature. He had full-blown cholangitis basically. There was no doubt about that, and the patient was hemodynamically stable. At this time, obviously, we were unaware of the patient being in the hospital. ERCP and stent change was planned by the gastroenterology team. As the previous stent was pulled out, there was a massive gush of blood was noted, and they could not see anything, and the bleeding continued. They could see just blood pouring out of the patella. Stent could not be replaced, and call was sent to the transplant team, and patient shifted to ICU and was having full-blown melena now. So just a question that, in these kind of situations, what would go in our minds at this stage? I think clearly the patient had an intercolloidal variceal rupture.
You should never think that this will come in your life, because even I have seen one of the most expert endoscopists in the country. I've faced this where then you have to give, 20 bottles of blood and you try everything. It's a most of the time some vein has really ruptured inside bile duct while you are trying to do it, and then it is bleeding. The question is, how well you can really control if you want to take a very disastrous, a strong kind of thing.
It's a young patient.
Exactly, you want to take one decision and want to try last something.
So obviously, when your mind is working, you start a resuscitation to get some time and you get some control of your sphincter at times, I guess. So the resuscitation was started, and we started getting arterial lines in, central lines in, getting the patient to ICU, getting the catheter. But quickly, the patient was having serial AVGs at that time because we didn't have blood. There was no blood at that time. Arranged by the time the blood and all is coming. So that you can see that consistently every 30-minute AVG showing that the blood is falling. So the melena continues. So now the inotropes were started at this stage to maintain mean arterial pressure above 70. So this is the CT scan which was done about 3 months before the episode. So luckily the patient was carrying this file, and you could see, and you can see that he's got, I don't have all the images here, sorry, I could not put all the images here. And you can see that this is a whole pancreatic cavernoma. There's actually just like a big mass. It was not really at all well defined intro. He has obviously got vascular splenomegaly. There is no any portal vein at all, and there is no SMB at all. When you look at the full images, and this is just a big varix and all the collaterals going into it. Splenic vein, you can just see over here. Sorry, I don't have all the images, but there was about 2 centimeters of splenic vein that you could see just beyond this over here. I think it's better in the next longitudinal section. So you can see that the splenic vein was being fed through all the varices, and there was a small end on really. And that is all. This is the scan from before. This is about 3 months before the episode. So clearly he had a stent in at that time as well, and probably this was the stent that was blocked. So, any suggestions at this stage? How to proceed? What is your plan at this stage? That's what really goes into your mind, and you know, being a new person in a new institute, I think sometimes
you said that they couldn't pass a stent again.
they couldn't see anything, so they could not
Because
see
of the blood.
because there's the blood there.
Yeah, I mean, that's a tough one, but one of the options could be a covered biliary stent. You could put, because you've got a stent across, so it won't be that difficult to get in, and maybe put a covered biliary stent to tide over the crisis. I would seriously look at the splenic vein, whether even operatively we can go clamp have a big clamp across the porta, and then try to do a shunt, so as hopefully the pressure would come down and some bleeding may be controlled. And I guess for a transplant surgeon also it's a big deal now with all this situation to get him out of it as a last resort.
I think the patient was septic as well, because he was previously cholangitic as well, and I think there was a septic load in this as well. So I think, I guess you have to take a dive with this, or sometimes we can't let skin stand between us and the diagnosis. I think that had to be the case here. So the decision was taken to take the patient to theta. We got about 10 units of blood ready, we got FFPs ready, and by the time everything was ready, we also wanted the patient to be boosted up a little bit with lines and inotrope. And we needed a kind anesthetist on our side. And so what investigations would you order at this stage? There was no much time really to investigate. And you couldn't get into the CT. The only thing I asked for here, was ultrasound in their Doppler just to make sure that the splenic vein was making that line. And because as sir said, that was one of the options obviously I was exploring in my head. I wasn't sure whether I could put a clamp at the bottom because there are so many varices there, and it's just a dangerous area at that time to explore in there. And so anyways, we took the patient to theatre. One of the pictures is not there. I could just get a clamp on the side of the bile duct. Just put on the side that was visible to me. I did not try and go around the porta at all because it was just a whole bunch, and this is all a cavernoma really. You could feel, it almost feels arterialized. You can feel big pulses in it. So, anyways, we planned for a quick splenectomy, and idea was to harvest, and it looked 3 centimeters on the previous CT, where it was virtually almost about a centimeter and a half of splenic vein. So we kept trying to mobilize it, and this is probably almost behind the pancreas there. And we did the shunt, as we said, we did the splenectomy, we did the shunt, and the shunt is there. So now, any more ideas in this situation? Like, would you do a hepatic adenostemy for this patient? That's what I'm asking, because clearly, he's still cholangitic, his bilirubin is about 14-15. And, even if I solve the bleeding, what's going in my mind is that his bile duct is still blocked. After all this, he's still going to die of sepsis. So, any ideas on that stage? Bleeding had stopped, because when we took it out, but we didn't know. The anesthetist told us it looks like the bleeding has stopped. The shunt was there. We could do it probably in about an hour and a half. Just get the quick shunt on, and then when I took the clamp off the bile duct. But at this time we're still thinking whether to explore or not. And then the anesthetist said it looks like the patient is stabilizing, that there is no active loss. In fact, the active loss probably stopped because when I put the clamp there, probably the bleeder was in there, and we must have got lucky. But there's no way to tell at the moment. But the patient stabilized after that, in the sense that he still required about 5 units of blood by this stage, by the time we finished it. we gave 1:1:1 ratio. So we gave 1 blood, 1 cryo, 1 FFP, 1 blood, 1 cryo, 1 FFP. And collaterals definitely collapsed. You could feel like adenoma that was there under my hand. I could clearly see it. I know the shunt was working, that was there, but we didn't know whether the bleeding had stopped inside the duct. There was no way of telling it. I knew the shunt was working. No, we didn't do it.
And then put a covered stent in if it's possible.
It is one of the possibilities. That is something I didn't think about. In fact, till now that you said, Madhu, this hadn't come to my mind of doing an intraoperatic biliary stent. That is probably one of the options. I hope I never get caught in this sort of situation again. But next time, I think that is one of the options to consider to do an intraoperatic cover stent.
I think, I mean, let's say, with,
Another would be you can do that uropractically and do the same thing what you do by
How many biases in the round you?
no, ideally you need to drain the bile duct because he's obviously got phalangitis.
It was
in the
just
second hit.
the whole of the the hepatototal ligament was just, you could just feel all varices and a mass. There was, you could not even get near that. Probably duodenum I could have opened up. You could done that. But as I said, this did not even come to my mind till now.
Maybe you plan an early ERCP post-operative. If the option of intraoperative ERCP is not there, you can plan an early post-operative
The
ERCP.
thing is, the problem with post-operative ERCP is you're losing an opportunity because you already have the patient open.
You only have that opportunity to be able to do that. So, if you're going to do something for him, that's the time to do it.
That may not be option is very good.
Yeah. So there's a lot of literature in that most of these people do not need anything doing with the bile duct with portal bilirubin because it resolves in 70% of the cases fine there. But here, I think after having done that, I could not really take a chance. We left the patient without the clamp on table for 3 hours. We used it like an ICU to get the resuscitation going. We all waited around to see whether the patient was stabilizing. Once we thought that the patient was stabilizing the parameters, the anesthetist was happy, we had caught up with blood, we could see a bit of urine. Then I think you have to gather some strength again. And I opened up the bile duct from one of the sides, from the side that from the right side, and we made a longitudinal cut rather than try and make any transverse cut. Yeah, that's what I was thinking. And this is one of the images that I have. Oops, sorry. So, luckily there was no active blood in there. There was a lot of clot in there. Slowly once we sucked this out and with a gentle irrigation, you could see the bile from the top end. And I didn't try and do anything more than that. And we did rule loop hepatocystinostomy on the end side. And we got this patient, and you can see the liver is totally cholestatic, probably because of the previous injury. This patient did well, and he came off anatropes at about 48 hours, I believe, and his bilirubin started falling by about day 3, and made good recovery. It worked well, that's all I want to say. He was discharged home at day 6, day 7, and his shunt continues to work 6 months post follow-up, and no problems to report so far. He's just father to child. And it's going okay. So I just wanted to present this.
One of the things which comes to mind is that operate, as we said, that patient is losing blood and all. We could while we are resuscitating, try octreotide, see whether the patient's bleeding gets controlled, and again go for an endoscopy. Even if the bleeding has come down marginally and if we can get a covered stent, that would still be an option which I would still consider, because these are situations which are very difficult, and getting into the bile duct with such big collaterals, what you showed on the 3 months old CT scan, is a very, very dicey situation.
I think if we had not been able to do the shunt, I probably would have not taken the chance of opening the bile duct, because
You did not write terlipacin also.
we gave octreotide, but sir said we started in ICU immediately after that. But there was continuous melena, you could continuously see a drop in HP. We were on about 10 of Norad, and I didn't want to wait any longer for him to be taken to theatre. So we waited for about 3 hours after that, but I didn't want to wait any longer by the time blood was ready, because otherwise you lose that window. And once the acidosis comes in, patient gets cold, then you just playing catch up there. So what we decided, and we talked to the family, either we take him now or we leave him alone. The other option is not to do anything and manage him conservatively. So either the decision had to be taken in 2 hours, because once what I felt that the patient was starting to get a bit cold. He was 31-year-old, age one on his side. But once they are 5-6 hours into it, I think you have a coagulopathic situation, then it's just a puddle in there.
Questions? Sorry. The question is whether you had waited for second stage operation for buying. That is the question. Normally, one would do shunt, hope for the best, allow time, so that the second operation would be much safer, better, quicker, and with good result.
I totally agree with you because the patient had 104 fever. 70% of these people never need a medical diagnostic because they just improve. But in this guy was septic even before we went in. So, having done half, and if you again bring him out with sepsis, then again you're thinking, why do all this? So I think I could not decide like you rightly said. It's a very, very hard decision. So we left the patient on table for resuscitation open for 3 hours. And once we were happy that the anesthesia was happy, then we went in and explored the time.
Have you got a MR in the follow-up of this patient? Because see, your hepatic vaginostomy is quite low. It's not a high hepatic vaginostomy. And the strictures are multiple and also in the left duct and all. I don't know whether you had a MR prior to know where the level of block was. But I mean, he's doing well, but I would like to get a MR because if there are more strictures, this is probably the time to deal with it endoscopically, and long-term endoscopic treatment, they do well for the residual strictures after that. So I think that will be something which he still needs us follow.
I'll definitely look into it. Thank you.
In a separate question, I think it's not very good to do it.
Trust me.
But if you provide no treatment,
Yeah.
then nothing visit that.
No, not in this case. I don't think so.
These are very abnormal veins, very difficult to access them. We were just discussing whether on the table glue or something would have worked. Very difficult.
And there are multiple veins, across. So how many can you take?
And this is intrapolydocal, so you have no really access to it. I guess probably, I don't know, with angiography or how good they are, but I don't think so. I don't think so. Put this patient for 3 hours on the OD table. Did you leave the abdomen open? Did you try a temporary closure? No. The abdomen will left open. We left it. You could have temporarily closed the abdomen, just use abdominal clips, close the skin. That would have helped your resuscitation. Close the skin, but we were still contemplating, so we just left it on the table for 2-3 hours. And yeah. Immediately see what happens. So you can keep directly assessing them now. Thank you.
Good.
This is the same hospital which is attacked by the terrorists last month. And it's just nearby the police station. This is the hospital, this is just nearby the police station. So I am presenting a case of hepatic with coldophilic with cholelithiasis. This 45-year married menopausal female was admitted on the 24th of April last year with history of recurrent pain in the right hypochondria, which is radiating to the back. There is history of fever from last 2 months. No history of jaundice. Past history. No history of bleeding pregnancy. No history of anemia. Only the positive history is there is no significant past history. On physical examination, there were only positive finding is just fever, placebo. And in lab investigation, platelet count was normal, FeNO was 9, and the LFT was within normal limits. Vidal, malaria, all those things are like this. On ultrasonography, basically there was polycysis with polytopolycysis. The CBD was related 1.2 centimeter with dilatation of the IHF, IHPR, common hepatic duct, and there was intraductal calculi. This is the ultrasonic picture which is showing intrahepatic calculi along with CBD stones. Upper GI endoscopy shows no ulcers, no esophagus or gastric varices. MRI for abdomen and emerson. CT shows polycysis with polycystitis. With polycystitis with dilated IHPR and calculi was very elevated. This is the MRI picture of this patient. In conclusion, as a summary, there is 45-year female with right hypochondrial pain, mild splenomegaly with polycystitis, polycanthalocystitis or pancreatitis, with no history of esophageal or gastric varices. So, the patient was planned for surgery. The plan of the surgery was open polycystectomy with CBD exploration, with intrahepatic stone extraction with the nephroscope, with drainage procedure, either colpotomy or categorization. There was no period basically on prior to that. This was done. Yeah. No, sir. This is basically there is no hemolytic workup. Yeah, anemia and splenomegaly were the 2 points that was positive. There was no workup on the hemolytic part. And we have a picture of that, basically it's on the So patient was built up for surgery. Operating findings. As a minimal fluid in the Morrison pouch, gallbladder was contracted, thickened, CBD was dilated with fibroid, thickened walls with multiple venous collateral on the lateral side of the CBD. And there was screening item collateral also present. So keeping in view the multiple collaterals and the screening item and CBD, the plan of surgery was changed. It's basically simple polycystectomy with CBD exploration, extraction of the stones with T-tube drainage. About more than hundreds of stones from both the right and left hepatic duct were taken up with nephroscope. With the help of nephroscope. Basically what happens post-operatively, patient's HB comes down along with that leukocytes counts that comes down to 100 only, and platelet count drastically comes down. Three units of fresh blood transfusion was given, and PVF was done that shows pancytopenia picture. And on 14th postoperative TT cholangiogram was done that shows no filling effect, free flow of the contrast in the duodenum. So taking precautionary measure even after that, the T2 was not removed, ERCP was done, and standing of the T2 was done, CBD was done, and T2 was removed. That shows incidental gastric varices postoperative. This is the pancytometric picture of the previous postoperative that was done. So, postoperatively patient having fever, wound sepsis, pancytopenic pictures, peripheral collaterals, splenomegaly, gastric varices. So, for further management, this was diagnosed postoperatively with intraoperative and postoperatively case of portal hypertension with hypersplenism. And patient basically was referred to PGI and taken up by the Dr. Yadav sir here. And rest of the things I worked up in the PGI. I think that was worked up as a case of extrahepatic portal hypertension with splenomegaly with hepatical cases. That was operated later on after, I think 1 year later on after that. Basically what happens, even though I have thought preoperatively, I agree that. But the reason for that is, on ultrasonography there was no collaterals, no clinical was found. It's MD radio diagnosis. And even though MRCP that doesn't show any. That's why I have taken. If I wouldn't come to know that that's the case of portal hypertension, I would have not taken up for this procedure.
And more so, why did you not consider ERCP pre-operatively, right?
One thing I would forget to mention, it was considered by the gastroenterologist, but he showed that I may not be able to clear all the stones from the right and left.
Both these things will.
No, but he told excuse for that. Yes, it's good.
Okay.
Post-operative.
And after 6 months, you find that the protocol is replaced by a
It seems to be pre-existing.
Could you remove all the stones from hepatic area?
Yeah, sir, almost with the nephroscope, I have removed all the stones. That was shown on ERCP also post-operative.
I would like to share a very small, very similar condition where I was called into salvage. I belong to Jalandhar. Due to some reason, I was operating in Adhampur. Some VIP youngster got into a problem. And as I had just given the incision, I got a very SOS call from Banga, right? Something similar had happened and the patient had bled massively. The surgeon was doing an open cholecystectomy. What he told me on the phone was that he'd given an incision, he just put up a sponge holder to give the traction, and that's it. The patient started bleeding massively. So I could not obviously leave my surgery, but I completed the surgery in Adhampur because there's nobody to rescue in that area. And after that, I just told him to pack it up. And I rushed to Banga, and what I saw was exactly a similar picture. The portal hypertension cavernoma had been missed, and the patient already had been transferred. I took around 1.5 or 2 hours to reach there, and already 10 units of blood had gone in. And that is the reason why it is very, very important to consider portal cavernoma in cholelithiasis or choledocholithiasis very, very seriously. The portal cavernoma there was missed by the radiologist. Credibility, which is very important, the credibility of the ultrasound scan that has to be taken into account. And the surgeon also, he should have at least seen before applying the traction, because then it will not give you any chance to salvage once the bleeding happens. And this again, a similar incident happened in another place in Punjab. So I think this is a very, very dangerous pathology. It should be known preoperatively.
Mike, please.
That's great. Very nice.
People who are working in the periphery are not working under optimum circumstances like we are here. Even we may not be under optimum circumstances, but they are in relatively compromised situation. And the experts here now should tell him what to do in such circumstances. Pre-operative ultrasound doesn't help you. On the table you find this, when to suspect cavernoma, what to do in such situation. I would request the experts to come up with the answer so that somebody who's dealing with such a case in future should be able to handle it in the proper way.
Did you listen to the question? When there is a cavernoma, we were discussing yesterday also, Dr. Nari Ramesh, we were discussing. The one thing is very clear, and there are people who say laparoscopy can be done, but one thing is very clear, don't do a laparoscopic surgery. That is one. Cavernoma, extrahepatic portal cavernous obstruction, because there are usually full of collaterals in the Kylots area, in the this pious plane which is between the gallbladder and the covering of the gallbladder. So the moment you enter that area, you will have a bleeding, hell of a bleeding. So it's very important that we should not go for a laparoscopic surgery. Point number one, and point number two. the what if you are planning only for this thing, the way your patient was, there was some suggestion of hypersplenism.
Yes.
So upper GI endoscopy must be done, and you must establish that what is the level of obstruction by doing seeing the varix, size of the varix, amount of varix, and that is the indirect predictor of the severity of the portal hypertension. And in a portal hypertension patient, even cholecystectomy doing is not an easy gift. So this is very, very important that you should not operate in a small center. That is very important if you don't have lots of support.
I have one more comment. See, these patients are high volume blood loss, but low pressure. So if you have patients and if you keep pressure as a swab, you'll be surprised that after some time the bleeding is stopped. And even if you have to do cholecystectomy, this is the right case where you should leave the posterior wall attached to the liver and just remove the front part, go up to the fundus or the infundibulum and close it there. This is where maybe subtotal cholecystectomy would be better than trying to achieve the complete gallbladder.
I think at this point, I mean, CPD stone is a more serious problem, and obviously it should not be attempted in the periphery in this situation. But I would say that if there is a extrahepatic portal venous obstruction and gallstone surgery is to be done, should get a contrast CT scan in these patients. Only ultrasound is not enough. That will tell you the number of collaterals and all on the gallbladder, because if there is a huge mesh of collaterals on that, you may, not do it in a small setup. You would want all the other things. And I think this point which Dr. Mehta made, that, just cut the gallbladder, the posterior wall to be left, and the edges to be continuously sutured, because they may not be bleeding at that time, but subsequently they will bleed. And you can close the cystic duct intra gallbladder rather than trying to loop the cystic duct and ligate it. Because again, once you're trying to loop it, you may injure a collateral and may have a massive bleed. It's a very, very difficult operation to do in EHPV or with cholecystectomy.
I mean, spleen and pancytopenia, a good hematological and endoscopy is necessary, I think. That is what you should do before. If you would have done that, probably would have not taken it to surgery.
Basically,
I'm going to expand on what Dr. Subbe said. You must always remember that the patient is not gallstones. The patient is a patient. He has gallstones, he could have had something else. In this patient, splenomegaly was an indicator. To my mind, a young patient with a CPD packed full of stones like this would be an indicator for suspecting something else. Maybe a hematological condition only, along with the presence of him. So I would have looked at it like this, that, let me investigate this patient a little more, rather than just concentrating that this patient has gallstones, and I should remove the gallbladder and get my money. So the attitude of we should not forget the basic premise or basic clinical assumption that this is not just gallstone, this is a patient, and a thorough clinical assessment of the patient will save you many times.
Very good, thank you.
With this, we come to the end of today's program. I would like to thank all the chairperson, speakers, and lastly the audience for being amazing. You're all invited for the gala dinner at Sector 24 Chandigarh, GI Club at 8 p.m. I request all of you to be there tomorrow. The program will start sharp at 8 a.m. Thank you. Good night.